Okay, hello. This video is meant to follow the American Pageant, Chapter 10, Launching the New Ship of State. I just wanted to say that this is my first attempt at doing a video like this, and I would like to also give an obligatory shout out to Sir Adam Norris, as we refer to him in my classroom, for all the quality videos that he has created and shared, as well as the inspiration to do this. So I'm sure that my students will have some interesting things to say tomorrow when I see them, but I think that this is a wonderful tool, and I hope that it can be that for my classroom as well. When I started reading this chapter, some things that came to mind were disorder, doubt, and debate. It really begins with this sort of 12-year look at the break from England and the formation of a new country, followed pretty quickly by the peaceful overthrow, but the overthrow nonetheless of our first government in the Articles of Confederation. And so, while there are other issues to deal with, relative lawlessness on the frontier and sort of a growing debt and depreciating money, I think it's really the ongoing debate as to the very nature of government that is the focus of this chapter. And it's interesting to see sort of the emergence of political parties based on that very issue as to, where should power lie and how should power be checked and so forth. It's a nice time to point out that in 1790 there are 4 million people living in the United States, and most of those folks are living in a rural sense. But again, in the East there are these cities that are growing. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, Charleston, Baltimore, all of these come to represent commercial interests and later industrial interests, and all of them come to be supported by Hamilton's Federalist ideas and strong centralized government. Obviously, in contrast to that, in the frontier, we have a different look and a different view of what the government should be. And Jeffersonian ideas, the Democratic Republicans sort of favor this smaller government and local autonomy over what they fear to be an unchecked centralized government that will result in tyranny. So I just love this textbook. I like how they kind of warn us of the smooth-talking Spanish and their seductive promises of independence on the frontier, and then reintroduce us to George Washington, sort of this anchor of American character. And I wanted to include some portraits, his early war years, his Revolutionary War years, this sort of iconic image of him here crossing the Delaware, and then the picture that I often think of when I think of George Washington right here, where he's, not wearing a military uniform. Maybe the first time in a long time he's not wearing a military uniform, but, it's just interesting that after the war is over, after his success, he doesn't seek any more glory. In fact, he kind of hopes to return to the quiet peacefulness of Mount Vernon, and ultimately that leads to the solidification of what we think of him as this bastion of integrity, an icon for America. He doesn't even campaign in 1789, and despite that, he has the unanimous support of the Electoral College, the only president in the history of our country to be able to say that. He's virtually unchanged in character despite his success, despite his fame, and he's described in the book as being more balanced than brilliant. He commanded his followers by strength of character rather than by the arts of a politician. And I really think that's something that the average person can identify with. And similarly, George Washington actually preferred kind of this quiet, serene life of Mount Vernon and his land and his business over the craziness of politics in the late 18th century. If the mark of good leadership is to surround yourself with people who know more than you do or have skills that you don't possess, I think George Washington did that. And so you really get to see kind of both sides of the spectrum with the cabinet that he creates. He has the proponent of small government in Jefferson. He has sort of the upstart and the figurehead for centralized authority in Hamilton, and he has Knox, and I don't have a lot to say about Knox, but in having both sides in what becomes the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, he can kind of manage them and help the pendulum to swing back and forth. Washington himself, though, does actually lean towards the growth of the national government, and the creation of the cabinet should be seen as that. I think the book does allude to this as sort of a loose interpretation of what it says in the Constitution, in that the President can require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments, but that is not exactly a green light to go ahead and create a cabinet. So, as discussed in Chapter 9, the Bill of Rights was sort of the turning point which allowed many, or at least enough, anti-federalists to support the new Constitution and therefore get it ratified. I think it's really interesting that states would ratify a document on the promise that a Bill of Rights would be added after the fact. I mean, I think that says a lot about sort of the way people interacted with each other and the way they trusted each other as well. But this document, of course, will safeguard the rights that we hold most dearly. You know, the most precious rights we have are protected with the Bill of Rights. And so we can thank James Madison for writing all of these and ushering them through Congress. You know, he had some foresight in that as well, because I know the book mentions that he had felt that if a constitutional convention were called, which of course is one of the ways that amendments can be added to the Constitution, that we might find ourselves scrapping the Constitution just as quickly as we did the Articles. So in order to avoid that and protect his baby, so to say, he drafts the amendments and gets them through Congress. Maybe the two that are perhaps the most important in terms of like the width that they have would be Amendment 9 and Amendment 10. Amendment 9, you know, is crucial in saying that if a right isn't listed here, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is going to be denied. And that kind of opens the door for this living document and a changing document and an evolving document. Amendment 10, on the other hand, actually protects the rights of states and the people. And so this sort of bolsters, I guess, what the Anti-Federalists would have wanted would be to reserve more rights to the states. At least it says here that if a right is not specifically listed or delegated to the federal government, that it's therefore reserved for the states or the people. Sort of getting back to the idea of expanding the government as opposed to restricting the Bill of Rights, the Judiciary Act of 1789 organizes the Supreme Court. It establishes that there will be a Chief Justice with 5 associates. It sort of organized the federal district courts and the circuit courts, and it establishes the office of Attorney General. That first Supreme Court Justice, John Jay. We'll see him again with Jay's Treaty, angering several people. And then we get to meet Hamilton a bit, and the way he's described is slightly alarming. You know, if he regarded himself as a kind of prime minister and on occasion thrust his hands into the affairs of other departments, then in some ways, you know, he's sort of not respecting boundaries. And obviously, here's his high school yearbook picture, by the way. Obviously, his largest conflict will be with Thomas Jefferson. The two had, you know, contrasting and opposing ideas about the very nature of government, and they come to be sort of the heads of these emerging political parties. But Hamilton is described to us as a financial wizard, and his plan will be, I guess, a trickle-down system, as I wrote here. You know, it's one that'll favor the wealthy. It's one that will protect the commercial interests, and therefore really kind of create a strong bond between the wealthy and the growing centralized government. You know, if they can do well financially, then they will invest in the federal government in the form of bonds, something that was not necessarily happening before Hamilton's financial plan. And in return, they will continue to support the federal government and to make sure that this financial plan, which favors them, will continue to exist. I just like sort of the creativity here in using the debt as an asset as opposed to a liability. And Hamilton realized that having this federal debt actually will kind of create a bond between debtors and creditors alike, that the federal treasury will be important to both of those parties. In order to do this and establish a line of credit for the United States, Hamilton funds all debts at par, which means simply that he pays them off at face value plus interest that they have accrued to that point. This is roughly $54 million. Hamilton further took on $21.5 million worth of state debts as well. Now, some states, like Massachusetts, were completely on board with this, and keep in mind that Massachusetts, being in the East, is more likely to have this federalist attitude and really support the ideas of Hamilton and commercial growth. In Virginia, however, they're not so enthusiastic. Now, Virginia may have been opposed in a fundamental sense, and I don't necessarily know where the line is on that. But they certainly did bargain their support for assumption with the location of the new federal district on the Potomac River. So, maybe it was a way to leverage a deal. Maybe it was a fundamental political ideal. It was likely both, and again, I don't know exactly where the line lies on that. Now, if you add it all up, Uncle Sam now owes $75 million, and obviously we need to raise revenue to pay that off. And so the two primary methods for that are through tariffs and through excise taxes. And this little chart here from the book shows us that, obviously we're going to talk about the excise tax on whiskey and the whiskey rebellion that followed that. But as you can see, the majority of revenue was to come, in fact, from custom duties. Now, these tariffs are, of course, a tax on imported goods. And in 1789, the first tariff taxed 8% on dutiable goods. But it also does protect sort of American industrial growth as well. There is the idea that if an American product is cheaper, then you will buy it rather than the import. And so the Pageant tells us that Hamilton had foresight and really desired to see the growth of American industry. And therefore, the tariff can be seen as a way to make that happen. Well, the excise tax on whiskey is going to cause a more immediate effect and impact. And as you can see, it says that farmers were charged 7 cents on the gallon. So that doesn't necessarily sound like a lot of money. But keep in mind that, in the West where this grain was being distilled, we primarily had a barter-based system. And in fact, whiskey was so abundant that it itself became a form of currency. I do remember the book mentioning that a priest somewhere was actually paid in Monongahela rye. And while that might sound strange to us, it just shows that whiskey was what was available and therefore could be traded. Keep in mind also that it is a distilled spirit, obviously, and so it takes a relatively large amount of grain to make a small amount of product, which does make it valuable. But given that the product is much smaller in terms of volume, it also makes it easier to transport, as the roads in the frontier region were less than great, and farmers have to bring their product to the market somehow. This enables them to do that. Now, these farmers also were dealing with other taxes. They're dealing with foreclosure, and typically they tended to be more in line with the Democratic-Republican mindset. And so they probably feared the tax man. They probably saw taxes as, kind of the road to tyranny, as the Anti-Federalists may have said. And I think that, we should say that the Whiskey Rebellion it should not be overlooked. It really demonstrates the conflict between the East and the West. The tax man literally represented centralized authority. And in fact, the figurehead of the federal treasury favored industry over agriculture. So, the farmers in the West were most likely perceiving this danger of taxes as a danger to their autonomy. And on top of that, they couldn't really afford the tax to begin with. So their resulting rebellion is not all that surprising. But what was surprising to some was how swiftly George Washington actually crushed the rebellion and the amount of force that he used to do that. So, keep in mind that, under the Articles of Confederation, when there was a similar agrarian rebellion in the West and Shays' Rebellion, the state of Massachusetts just didn't have the same kind of quickness in putting down the rebellion. And in fact, that was a prime reason why people started to favor this idea of a stronger centralized government. Back to the ongoing debate, though, as to the nature of government, Hamilton and Jefferson reflect their constituents. quite accurately. Hamilton and his Federalists really support this Eastern commercial and financially minded interest. That's really a stronghold in the East. And the Jeffersonians, the Democratic Republicans, they have a different approach, and they have a sort of a small government approach, and they reflect this agrarian interest. And while they disagree in general, it's very clear as to where they stand if you look at the creation of the Bank of the U.S. I should say now that prior to Jefferson and Madison's challenge to Hamilton's program, political parties in the United States didn't really exist. Some consider the failure of the framers to foresee the creation of political parties as sort of like the failure that the framers had, despite all their successes. But they just didn't see it happening on the scale that it happened, I suppose. There were factions that existed around common interests, but the two-party system that we have come to know just didn't really exist. The interesting thing about the two-party system is that it really works to sort of regulate the ebb and flow of politics. And so the party that is not in power, the loyal opposition, kind of helps the pendulum from swinging too far to one side. I just wanted to include this chart from the book to try to make some sense out of. I think sometimes students get confused by the name of Democratic Republicans and where does that go, and so I wanted to include this here and make sure to draw your attention to it. Back to the Bank of the United States, Hamilton sees this as sort of the means to enact his financial plan, and he hopes to create a private institution with roughly $10 million in capital, a fifth of which will belong to Uncle Sam. Stocks will be sold to the public, and it will be chartered for 20 years. It's planned to be located in Philadelphia. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that you have to think about whether or not the Constitution says the government actually has the authority to create and operate a bank. And it doesn't necessarily say that, at least not explicitly. And so here you get to the real root of the difference between the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. And so we're going to use the phrase a loose construction of the Constitution or a strict construction. And Hamilton will say that we ought to look at the Constitution with sort of a creative eye and that allow it to be applied to things as they come up, whereas Jefferson will look at this as sort of a more literal sense. So how does Jefferson define his argument? He says, Amendment 10 states that the powers not listed in the federal government ought to be left to the states. State-run banks might actually check a tyrannical government. It might prevent sort of the runaway power of a centralized authority, something that they feared from the onset. Hamilton, on the other hand, cites the Elastic Clause. So, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18, the Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. And those are probably the two words that you should know, right? Necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. So, what does that actually mean? Well, it does say explicitly that Congress has the right to tax and regulate trade, and Hamilton's going to argue that a bank is in fact a necessary or at least a proper means for doing just that. So again, this is a logical argument that is using the law of the land, the newly created law, and not necessarily inventing a power, but interpreting what it says to expand the power of the federal government. Ultimately, Hamilton is successful and a Bank of the United States is created. So I did steal this slide from Adam Norris as a way to help you remember the gist of Hamilton's financial plan, and that includes, of course, the Bank of the U.S., the excise taxes on whiskey, funding the debt at par, again, paying for it up front plus interest, assuming state debts, and, of course, using tariffs as a way to raise revenue. I also want to say that, and I tell my students this all the time, that financial independence is what creates your actual independence. And I'm saying that in terms of becoming an adult, right? When you start paying your own bills, you're officially on your own. And so financial independence and financial responsibility for the federal government certainly creates or adds to the credibility, globally, of this young republic. Changing gears from finance into foreign policy, we're going to look at the French Revolution very briefly and point out that, in the beginning phases, at least the book says this, I'm not an expert on the French Revolution, so please take this for what it's worth, but there's a relatively peaceful phase in which they're trying to kind of restrict Louis XVI with a constitution of sorts. But in 1792, things get a little different. And at that time, Washington is entering into his second term. And so he begins to turn his attention towards foreign policy. We should also remind ourselves that, in general, I suppose, everybody kind of feared the masses, but especially the Federalists, and they feared the mobocracy, as they refer to some of the craziness in France. While the Democratic Republicans, they kind of in an idealistic and ideological sense, sort of favored the French Revolution and enlightened political thinking. Washington, however, hoped to remain neutral. And I think the Pageant tells us very clearly that most of the framers, if not all, realized that staying neutral, staying out of conflict for as long as humanly possible was an essential move for the young republic, because they just weren't in a position to kind of bind themselves in some sort of military or political alliance. Now, obviously, we had an alliance with France, that was created during the Revolutionary War itself, and so we're kind of on the fence. But Washington, without consulting Congress, announces that America will be neutral, and thus kind of sets the course for American neutrality. I think the fact that he abandoned our former French friends who helped liberate us from the tyrannical King George III probably caused a lot of concern, as well as the fact that he didn't even consult Congress. He just issued this statement on his own that probably caused a lot of concern of a growing executive that's stepping outside of what we assumed he was to be doing. Now, the French are not necessarily thrilled either. They probably were asking us to remember our alliance, and they sent this man, Edmund Gainey, to the United States. And again, with the book and kind of making me laugh a little bit, they said he was all sail and no anchor. And so you can take that for what you mean it to be. But he was also warmly received by the Jeffersonians. And to some extent, he thought that America truly, at least the people of America, wanted to see this strong Franco-American alliance. And he even thought that he would take it to the American sovereign voters and let them decide, despite the fact that George Washington preferred neutrality. It was quickly requested that he be replaced, and he was. Okay, enough about the French for a little bit. Let's talk about the British question again. There are plenty of British posts in America still. Again, this is sovereign America, and the English are still here. And I think in a general sense, they're just kind of a bit of a headache for the United States. They're manipulating the natives. They're arming the natives on the frontier and encouraging them to just wreak havoc. Specifically, I guess Chief Little Turtle of the Miami had defeated General Josiah Harmer and Arthur St. Clair in 1790 and 91, and these are significant losses for the United States on the frontier. So, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, the United States experienced a very significant victory in the Northwest Territory. Here, General Mad Anthony Wayne routed the Miami tribe. At the time of their retreat, the British actually abandoned them and did not take them in their time of need, and so ultimately they are forced to sign the Treaty of Grenville. In this treaty, they actually ceded land to the United States. They gave hunting, which they also did receive hunting rights for doing this, and they received financial compensation for their losses. There was, I believe, $20,000 up front and an annual payment of $9,000 per year. But within the treaty, they are sort of codifying a position of inferiority for themselves. Continuing with the problems with the English, Britain was impressing American sailors, basically forcing them to join the British military. This is a problem we'll talk about later with the War of 1812. The Democratic Republicans are kind of going to rally around the cry of the sailors. They're calling for a war. Let's fight off the oppressive King George III again, or at least maybe an embargo. Everybody likes an embargo. The Federalists are not thrilled about going to war with England. Keep in mind that tariffs under the Hamilton's financial plan require continued trade, and so threatening the relationship with a trade partner in England would not be a good idea. We need to protect the First Bank of the United States, seen right here, and we need trade and peace as much as possible in order to stay successful as the young republic. So what we do? We send John Jay to negotiate. And he does negotiate. Unfortunately, either he was really bad at negotiating, or the fact that Hamilton had sort of transmitted his strategy to the English, he doesn't necessarily bring back favorable terms for the United States. The British do agree to evacuate the posts that they held in America, and they do agree to pay for current damages or previously incurred damages, I suppose, as a result of that. But at the end of the day, Americans have to honor pre-war debts, and a lot of that is going to fall onto sort of the agrarian class, further dividing the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. Here's a map from our book showing those posts along the St. Lawrence and in the Great Lakes region here. To further show the weakness of Jay's treaty, there's no real mention of future damages. There's no mention of supplying the natives. And so I don't know that Jay was all that warmly received when he got home. Certainly Democratic Republicans were enraged because they are going to have to pay the English debts that they thought were forgiven, while the commercial interests of America are being secured and protected through the treaty. Probably caused a whole lot of animosity towards that Eastern establishment and Federalists in general. And there they are again. I did look for an angry picture of Thomas Jefferson, but they're hard to come by. Speaking of treaties, Spain is quick to deal with the United States, and keep in mind that the Mississippi River was a vital lifeline for trade. It was the way to move goods in the western part of the United States, and so the Spanish had basically had control previously of the Mississippi River. They actually will grant free navigation to Americans, and they also grant the right of deposit to the United States, meaning that they could store crops and goods and so forth in New Orleans, which will greatly help facilitate American trade. Just to talk more about Washington and his legacy and his impact on sort of the American political tradition, in 1796 he issues a farewell address. In doing that, he's establishing the tradition of a two-term presidency, and again, he's voluntarily giving up power. I'm not president, but I understand that it is an incredibly taxing job, that it is, if you look at presidents over their two terms, Barack Obama is a great example, they just seem to age significantly, and I think that we all have a pretty good idea as to why that is. Just the day-to-day stress and rigor of being president must be pretty challenging. So maybe that's why Washington left the office, but it might also have been sort of for posterity, and again, preventing against like a lineage or hereditary kind of transfer of power, and establishing the idea that a virtuous politician should not necessarily seek office. And I think that fits well with the disinterested kind of attitudes of what a politician should be in 18th century America. He also, in the same breath, warns against permanent alliances, and again, that kind of like is furthering along this idea of American isolationism and will become a key component of American foreign policy for quite some time. What did he accomplish? Well, for one, there was no, overthrow of the Constitution under his watch, at least. In fact, the republic is not only alive, but financially it's on its feet. Geographically, it's expanding, and it's not currently at war. Which, as I said earlier in this presentation, the framers knew that playing for time, delaying any kind of active involvement, is probably the best thing that the United States can do in its first years. So who follows? Not the most popular guy, that's for sure. Who is this? It's John Adams. And I mean, I guess, even if he was charismatic and well-liked, it'd still be pretty tough to follow George Washington. I mean, George Washington, I think, was that well-liked and that influential in that respective that just would not want to follow him in the talent show. But he's also much more moderate than some of the other Federalists, primarily Hamilton. In fact, our book kind of alludes to the idea that Hamilton will be an enemy of him, and they remind us that Adams is going to have conflict with France, and that he's not popular. And despite the fact that he is experienced, people aren't going to rally around him as he probably would have hoped, or any of us would have hoped if we were in that situation. Okay, back to Adams's conflict with France. The French are not very happy about Jay's treaty, and they begin seizing Yankee merchant vessels in their own right. So the United States will send John Marshall, who himself becomes future Chief Justice, to France to try to reach some sort of agreement. And en route, he's met by 3 agents, just referred to as X, Y, and Z. And they actually wanted a bribe of $250,000 just for the right to speak to Foreign Minister Talleyrand, not even for like a guarantee of his support. Well, I read in the book that bribes in European politics were fairly common, but John Marshall just wasn't having it, and so he refuses and returns home to be welcomed as a hero. Following this, the United States Navy is expanded, the Marines are reestablished, and between 1798 and 1800, a combination of privateers and man-of-wars actually captured over 80 French ships. Adams, however, again agreeing with the idea that the young republic should avoid war at all costs, does send a second envoy to France, and an agreement is made. And the agreement is that they will end the military alliance with France, and that the United States will pay damage claims of American shippers. At the same time, the Federalists passed 2 laws that are probably seen as oppressive by the Democratic Republicans, the first of which are the alien laws. And these, as you can see, are targeting newcomers to the country, immigrants that would be poorer and more likely to join the Democratic Republican Party. And in order to limit or discourage their passage to the United States, they changed the residency laws for citizenship from 4 to 14 years. They also established that the president could deport dangerous foreigners in a time of peace, and in a time of war, the president could imprison dangerous foreigners as well as deport them. Furthermore, the Sedition Act made it a crime to impede the policy of the government or falsely defame its officials. I was talking about this in class today, and in my civics class actually, and just asked if anybody had gotten in trouble for creating a meme about our current president or anybody else in government for that matter, and of course we all had a good laugh. But keep in mind that in times of where national security is endangered, sometimes the individual freedoms that we really value very highly are limited. This happens again during the first and second Red Scare in 1920 and the 1950s as well. And some might say with the Patriot Act as an infringement on our personal freedom and liberty. So the Sedition Act is not necessarily outside the norm for, I guess, the American political scene, but it seems to be the first time now that the federal government is kind of curbing freedoms that it just recently granted. Even though there are some that are not thrilled about this, the Federalists and their party scores a sweeping victory in the congressional elections of 1798 and 1799. Now, an interesting thing happens here because I think probably a lot of people were afraid about, impeding the federal agenda and so forth. But in Virginia and Kentucky, and this is going to be Madison and Jefferson, these two resolutions are written and passed by the state Congress. And essentially it says that the states have a right to nullify a law that they feel are unconstitutional. And this very point is used later on during Southern secession to support, their break from the Union. And again, it represents states' rights, and it represents local autonomy, and it represents sort of small national government. It's a pretty bold statement, I think, without question. Okay, thank you for watching. If you made it this far, I'm impressed. And again, I hope that this presentation will sort of supplement the notes that you took on Chapter 10 and some of the things that we talk about in class. I just wanted to try to provide, another angle at the content and sort of share some of my thoughts on that as well. Thank you very much.